Let's talk about stargazing in the north of England and consider what we can see in the night sky using a variety of different methods. The problem we have, of course, is the weather. Very often we suffer from cloud and rain, so you need patience and persistence to be an astronomer in our part of the world. However, the plus is that we do have some of the best dark sky sites available within driving distance of where we live. So Kielder, Derwent, Walk all present wonderful opportunities to see a truly dark sky and some magnificent objects in it. I've put an icon stream in this presentation just to clearly indicate what is required to see some of these objects. Naked eye visibility, I think, self-explanatory. Telescopic objects are those things that really can't be fully appreciated unless you have a telescope. And there are certain things which really can be quite disappointing in a telescope, but when you use a camera time exposure, reveal them in their magnificence and in great detail. Some things related to viewing events related to the sun present us with an eyesight risk, a hazard that really requires us to use either image projection or special filtration to do this safely. So keep an eye out for these icons as they appear. So we start off fairly logically, I would hope, with naked eye. And one of the most pleasing things for any astronomer is to learn the constellations. They really are the best aid to navigating the night sky and understanding where things are and what you can expect to find throughout the seasons of the year. And they have, of course, enabled people both on land and sea to navigate for many centuries. And they contain a lot of folklore if that's something that holds your interest. The other thing we can see of a whole range of options really is conjunctions, when one planetary or night sky object aligns closely with another. Doesn't mean that they're physically close together, it just means that the line of sight places them close together in the sky. So like this image here is Jupiter within a few degrees of the moon. And very often this can actually involve more than one object. You know, we've seen events fairly recently where we've had the moon and 3 planets, which is really quite spectacular and gives you a feel for the solar system that we live in. Occasionally, one of these objects will pass over another object. Again, no physical proximity, just line of sight, as in this picture with the moon about to pass over the star Aldebaran in the constellation of Taurus. Some of the more spectacular occultations are of the planets, with probably Saturn being the favourite because its rings sort of peek out from behind the moon as it emerges from the occultation. It's quite nice. Probably even more nice and more spectacular is an eclipse, be it lunar or solar. Now, unfortunately, solar eclipses don't happen very often, and they don't happen very often in this country. And when they do, as was the case in Cornwall last, there's a chance they'll be clouded out. So most of the people who've really successfully viewed solar eclipses travel abroad to do so, to countries where the cloud cover is slightly more predictable. There is, of course, with solar eclipses, the need for filtration and special caution when viewing, but with the moon, that's not an issue. There is a lunar eclipse coming up in July, albeit that it happens around moonrise. So the moon, when it's totally eclipsed, will be actually very low above the horizon. But given the sky's clear and given you've got a good horizon to view, it should be very spectacular. The other thing where we have a benefit living in the north is with the northern lights. At the moment, they're not that frequent because the sun is at solar minimum, but sites like the Wascally Reservoir, some of the sites on the coast like St Mary's Lighthouse do offer an opportunity to view the aurora, and they can be very spectacular and can also be a very good object for a standard camera photography approach. Now, when we come to telescopes, it's worth noting that this is one of the most common questions we get asked: what telescope should I buy? And our normal response is, well, don't. Come to the society, come and see what others have before you make any decisions, because there isn't a single telescope that meets everyone's needs. There isn't certainly one that meets everyone's budget. And the technology and the complexity of these instruments varies enormously. And there's pluses and minuses to be weighed up. But this is just a selection of the sort of telescopes that are available. Newtonian reflectors, standard refractors, what are called catadioptic telescopes, Schmidt-Cassegrain, Maksutov. These are telescopes which have a much longer focal length than you would actually think, because of the way the light path runs within the instrument. So, as I say, best thing is err on the cautious side. Come and join, or come and visit, don't have to necessarily join, and see what other people are using. So the obvious thing, and the thing I favour actually, with a reasonable amount of success, is the moon. These are both my images, and as indicated, one of them was actually chosen and paid for, unbelievably, as the cover picture for one of the leading magazines. This is obviously the total lunar disk at both first and last quarter. You can then, if you want, using the right technology, you can close in and capture detail of individual craters. This is the southern uplands, as we call them, featuring the notable crater Cassini, which is about 160 miles across, about the distance from Newcastle to Birmingham, the width across that crater. Here it is a bit closer. Very interesting crater, lots of detail within it. Visually a very nice object to look at. More craters. There's such an immense amount of detail on the surface of the moon that it is within the reach of quite modest telescopes, and probably the reason I'm doing it is because it's also a relatively easy object to produce good images of. Copernicus, another one of the major craters, about 60 miles across. You notice the central mountains in the middle of the crater. Again, at the right phase, a very nice object to view. So we come now moving away from the moon to the solar system as a whole. And of course, the sun contains probably 99% or more of the mass of the solar system. So it's a major object. It's also an object that has a lot of interest and a lot of detail to be seen, particularly with the right sort of telescope. It's a bit quiet at the moment because it's solar minimum, but as things get more active, there'll be sunspots and a lot of activity. But this is an image taken with a specialized and specially filtered telescope. So you can see enormous amount of detail, the solar prominences and the granulation of the solar surface. But it does need special telescopes, it does need care, and there is a hazard. You need really, we can't make this more emphasized than anything, but it's dangerous to view the sun through a normal telescope. It needs to be a specially adapted telescope. Moving out from the sun, we come to the planet Mercury. Now, Mercury is quite a difficult object to view, albeit that in March it's actually relatively well positioned in the evening sky, so you've got a chance of seeing it in March. Look for Venus over to the west and you'll find Mercury nearby. But this is 2016 with the planet crossing over the disk of the sun. It was a stunning day, this beautiful sunny day, not a cloud in the sky, and we had a great time viewing this particular phenomenon. Then Venus, which is generally visible either in the morning or the evening. Because it's within the orbit of the Earth, it shows phases like the Moon. It shows very little in the way of surface detail because, of course, it's cloud covered. It's not a very nice place. It's extremely hot. The clouds contain sulfuric acid and the atmospheric pressure is enormous. So it's not a place that we'd be naturally looking for life at the moment, but it's nonetheless an interesting object. Mars, it's an object that has a strong following in the science fiction field. It's the place that we're most focused on, both as a search for life, but also as a potential place for human beings to colonize. So it's a big interest for a lot of people. It's quite a small planet when you view it through a telescope. It is, of course, smaller than the Earth, but you can see surface detail, you can see dust storms, you can see the polar caps. And, this is an image I took from my garden in Washington. So it's with a good telescope, it's an object that's freely visible and will actually get better this year, albeit never gets to a particularly good altitude above the horizon. It should be quite spectacular later in the year. Jupiter, really the king of planets and lovely object to view. This is an image from Keith Johnson, who is an exceptional photographer of planetary images. You can see the great red spot, which is a huge storm on the planet. Bear in mind that this is a planet that's diameter is something like 11 times more than the Earth, but which rotates very rapidly. Its day is only about 9 hours, so there's a lot of activity in the atmosphere. It's a very interesting object to look at, and it has a whole family of moons which are even visible in binoculars. So there's a lot of interest, a lot of spectacular views to be had with this particular planet. Planet Saturn, obviously with its rings, probably the singularly most spectacular object to view, the one that most people reference back to when they reflect on their viewing history as an amateur astronomer. Does have some level of surface detail, but the big draw and the big spectacle is the ring formation, plus quite a number of moons that are visible in a telescope as well, including probably one of the more interesting moons in the solar system, Titan, which is the only one that has a really strong atmosphere, surface atmospheric density higher than Earth, albeit that it's very, very cold. Now we move into what I'd call the deep sky arena. And you notice some of these things I've put a naked eye visibility symbol as well, because the Seven Sisters, for instance, the Pleiades here, it's probably best viewed with binoculars because it's quite a wide field object. You can see it clearly with the naked eye. It's called the Seven Sisters, although actually there are 9 bright stars that can be viewed. But with the time exposure shuts as shown here, you can see the nebulosity that surrounds these stars. They're very young stars, very hot stars in some cases. And these are stars that are physically associated with each other. This is not just a line of sight. This is a true cluster of stars that are gravitationally bound to each other. The other thing that people don't realize you can see with the naked eye is the Andromeda Galaxy. You have to have exceptionally good, clear skies, but you can see it, and it's 2.5 million light years away. So it's phenomenal. But with the time exposure, you get the detail, the gas lanes, the satellite galaxies, and you're looking really at a virtual twin of our own galaxy. So you get a feel for where we are. And in due course, in a few million years' time, it will actually collide with our galaxy, and the two are likely to merge. Moving on to deep sky, and I probably should have a naked eye symbol for this, because actually the Orion Nebula is visible to the naked eye, albeit as a small little fuzzy patch. But with a camera, it reveals what is one of the most spectacular sights in the night sky. It's the cradle of birth for new stars. It's gas producing amazing views, and with the time exposure, there's a lot of color and detail that comes through. It sits just below the belt of Orion. And I put this picture of the telescope on because Chris Duffy took this picture, but this is basically the sort of scope that he uses. It's a reflector, but you'll notice there's a little telescope to the right, which is his guide scope, which actually controls the drive of the telescope mount to give higher levels of accuracy and to allow for much longer exposures. This is the sort of equipment you need if you're going to be looking to image these sort of objects. Another one from Chris, the Crab Nebula, an exploding stellar system. Actually, the explosion being witnessed in 1054 and recorded at that time as a new star, a supernova, and over the following years it throws the gas out. Dumbbell Nebula, planetary nebula, again the net result of a star explosion, the end of a stellar system, albeit that the remaining star lies still visible in the middle of the nebula. Oops, I went one too far there. This is a star cluster. These are hundreds of stars that are physically locked to each other. There are a number of these to be viewed in the night sky. This is one of my pictures. Visually through a telescope, they're lovely objects. They're sort of objects that don't actually disappoint, but that again, they're even more spectacular if you take the time to photograph them. Quite a long way away, nearly 34,000 light years away, so, but within the galaxy. A separate galaxy, another galaxy showing the true spiral arm structure. This photograph from Dave Shaw, very similar setup to Chris, but lovely clear indications of the spiral structure of the galaxy. Another object in Orion, very close to the bright star in the middle, is Alnitak, which is one of the stars in the belt of Orion. This is called the Horsehead Nebula, for obvious reasons. These are gas clouds that are being backlit by the light of the stars within and behind them. the rosette. Now you can see clearly why it's called the rosette. This is quite an extensive time exposure, quite a lot of processing of the image required. And certainly if you look through a scope, you wouldn't see this level of colour, but as you photograph it, this is the sort of detail that comes out and shows you the complexity of this object. Again, it's a gas cloud where stars are forming, but having blown out from a star that previously exploded. Another one, the flaming star, for obvious reasons, the bright star in the middle, which is a blue star, which means it's a very hot star. And this image shines by dint of reflecting the light of the stars, but it also emits light in its own right, that the atoms within the gas are excited and luminesce. The crescent in Cygnus, an image from Steve Carr. Very lovely, nice subtle colours, but something you'd never see to any great advantage just visually. So called the Pac-Man, because if you look at it, it looks a bit like the Pac-Man ready to collop down some stars. Another really impressive spiral galaxy, which is taken by a society member, as yet anonymous, but lots of colour, lots of detail, and quite clear structure to this galaxy. We're looking from the top, as it were. The Heart Nebula, again one of those more obvious names, same sort of nebulosity, exploding out from a central point in the constellations of Perseus. Now, one of the other things that are quite nice to look at, and by and large these are true binary stars. They're stars that they orbit around each other, which is quite common. A lot of stars are multiple systems. The nearest system to us, Alpha Centauri, is a multiple star system. This is Albireo, which is most notable because when you look at it through a telescope, it really does have dramatic colour. One star is a very bright yellow, the other star is a very crystal clear blue. And that reflects their different temperatures, but it's a lovely object. Just looking with a bit more detail at equipment options, as I've said, good idea, visit the society. The challenge you're going to be presented with is whether you go for a telescope that is basically mechanical, it's not computer assisted, but it's within a budget, particularly the Dobsonian reflector, which is the one down here at the bottom. The Dobsonian offers great big aperture, good value for any given budget, and very often, because it gives good aperture, you'll see a lot more things than you might in other scopes. The downside is you have to find those objects yourself. Whereas nowadays, even quite modest telescopes like this one here, which is my Maksutov, come with a mount that is fully capable of tracking and also finding objects in the night sky. So you're not required to learn the night sky in detail because the telescope will find them for you. But if you want to get into photography, then you come into these things like guided scopes, sophisticated mounts, and then if you really get hooked, you have to do things like I've done and make a shed where the roof runs off, which makes life very convenient in terms of being able to quickly get your telescope into action in those brief moments when the clouds part. Just quick mention of the Society. We're based in the Washington Wildfowl Center. We have a whole range of telescopes there. We have a 14-inch telescope in a proper observatory dome. We have another runoff shed where a variety of instruments can be used. The biggest thing is you'll find a whole host of very friendly people, very experienced, and very happy to share their experience with you. So if you're thinking about taking up the hobby, if you're thinking about buying a telescope, or if you just want some information on astronomy as a topic, then come along and visit because we're more than happy to see you.